But welcome everybody. I'm Jessica. It's nice to see you guys virtually this morning, and thanks for getting up early on your Saturday morning to learn more about debate. I know that everything you learned today is really going to help you in the upcoming tournaments. We do have we actually have 5 debate tournaments this semester, which is more than usual. So you're going to have a lot of opportunities to get more into this topic. And so this morning we're really lucky because we actually have a law professor with us today who has also had experience as a public defender to talk a lot about the topic. And her name is Professor Sara Hidebrand. She actually works at the DU Sturm College of Law. So is anybody here thinking about law school? You think that might be part of your future? Well, if you are, this is an awesome opportunity to see what it's like to be in class with a law professor this morning. So you'll be way ahead of your peers. She's going to speak on her experience with criminal justice reform. And specifically, we're going to talk about the defund police affirmative. So if any of you, I'm sure you'll all be facing that case on the negative, but if any of you are considering running that case on the affirmative, this will be a good opportunity to ask Professor Hidebrand some questions. And she's also worked as a Colorado public defender, so she has a lot of firsthand knowledge. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hidebrand.
Thanks, Jessica. So what I'd like to do, if it's possible, because we have such a small group, is just go around and have folks introduce themselves. Maybe you could just say your name and I guess maybe what got you interested in DUDL and where you go to school, and then where you are in your education, like what grade you're in, and then what your aspirations are for the future. I think that would be really helpful to me in knowing where folks are, and so then we can have a discussion that's as helpful as possible to you. So Matthew, you were here first, so if you wouldn't mind, would you kick us off and then pass to one of your peers when you're done?
Matthew?
Yeah.
Are you there? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Thinking. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So you told me where you go to school, and I didn't catch what grade are you in, Matthew?
I'm in 9th grade.
Okay, great. And then when you finish with school, what are you hoping to do, or what kind of got you into debate?
Okay. I used to go to DCIS.
Okay.
And they had a debate team, and that was practically the only thing I liked about it, other than Chinese class.
Cool.
But debate stuck with me, and I moved on to Westgate, but I still was on a debate team in DUDL.
Great. Well, thanks very much for being here this morning. What about you, Jasmine?
My name is Jasmine. I'm a 9th grader as well. I go to West, and how I got into debate was actually I was recommended, not recommended, but someone told me about it because Doodle is actually not on the side of West Leadership Academy. It's only in West Early College. So I was the first to be there. But what I plan on in the future is opening up my own business company.
Great. Entrepreneurial. That's awesome. Thanks very much for being here, Jasmine. How about you, Alexander?
Well, if you prefer, you could call me Alex.
Okay, sounds good.
And I'm a 6th grader.
Great.
I'm on West, and I got in because someone actually told me about it. Then
Great.
I went in.
Yes,
yeah. Jessica, what were you saying? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. We're so excited to have you as part of the Doodle, Alex.
All right, Alex. Well, thanks very much for introducing yourself and for being here. So I guess I made some notes about the defund the police and maybe can speak to that issue from the perspective, as Jessica said, I was a public defender in the Colorado State Public Defender System for 6.5 years. I worked in the Four Corners in Southwest Colorado, Durango and Cortez and that area of the state for 4 years, and then I was in the Arapahoe County office at just south of Denver for a couple years before I came to DU, which is where I went to law school. And I'm a clinical teaching fellow in the criminal defense clinic at the law school. So what we do is second and third year, law school is a 3-year program. So in your second or third year, you can apply and interview and enroll in a clinic. And one of the clinics is the one in which I work, which is the criminal defense clinic. So what students do is they actually represent clients. So myself and my teaching partner, Professor Lindsay Webb, the students represent clients. They do all of the client meetings and investigation and legal research and preparation and courtroom presentation. And so Professor Webb and I are there with them when they go to court to support and supervise them. But the students actually get to represent clients themselves. So I think most people find that a helpful experience after having been just in the classroom in law school for their first year. We, at the beginning of each semester, do a 3-week-long intensive orientation where we go through all the skills the students will need to represent clients on their own, or at least get them started, get their feet wet a bit. And so we're almost to the end of that orientation for our spring semester, and the students are about ready to take off and start representing their own clients. So that's just a little bit about what I do and what our program is about. But before I move on, I'll ask if anyone has questions about that. Okay. I invite you to ask questions throughout this presentation. I do have some notes that I want to present, but I was hoping that we could have a really interactive discussion this morning, as I'm happy to answer questions you all might have as you prepare for your upcoming tournaments. It sounds like you have a number of them coming up. So what I wanted to talk about first is that it was in your materials a bit. Your materials touch on this, but the history of policing sort of developed on 2 different lines as I see it. One in the South, where, of course, were slave states before slavery became illegal, and so in the South in particular, policing has its roots in slave patrols. And so what those were, they were white volunteers basically who were empowered by their communities to use vigilante tactics. So sort of like whatever tactics they saw fit. It wasn't the process to punish then enslaved people wasn't sanctioned by the courts. It was kind of like they located and returned the enslaved people who had attempted to escape to their slave owners. They suppressed uprisings by enslaved people, and then they punished enslaved workers who were found or believed to have been in violation of the rules on the plantations in which they lived. So, and then after slavery became illegal, you may be familiar with, or may not, it's okay too, Jim Crow laws. So that those were laws that there was a time after slavery became illegal where all kind of public facilities were separated by race, right? So segregated rather. So for example, you may have seen pictures of like water fountains, right? There were two of everything, one for white folks and one for folks of color, specifically mostly Black people. And the police were in charge of enforcing Jim Crow laws. So during that time, government enacted a lot of laws that were sort of just designed to criminalize behavior in which folks of color disproportionately, I guess, were policed. And that's been a continued practice to the present, right? So then Jim Crow laws were outlawed, and a lot of you have probably heard about the war on drugs. There have just been sort of it's been an iterative process of the police and the government trying to find ways to criminalize and over-police communities of color. So there are, policing has really racist roots is what I'm trying to say. Do you folks have questions about that?
I wanted to know not where you were at, but what was happening during the time when Elijah McClain's case came back up, and what did you start studying it, or what did you do?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jasmine. Elijah McClain was murdered by the police in Aurora just recently, right? And that's like a great example of how even today, right, police, there, is over-policing in communities of color like that in which Elijah McClain lived, and violence towards people of color, right? And in Elijah McClain's case, he was unarmed and wasn't committing any crimes, and he was murdered by the police, right? And it's just a stark example of, and to date, none of the police who were involved in his murder have been prosecuted or subject to any kind of criminal justice enforcement, right? So I don't know if you have, is that kind of what you were asking, Jasmine, or do you have other questions about that?
Since you're in law school, did you learn anything when it was happening?
So I actually graduated from law school in 2012, and then I worked as a lawyer for a long time, and now I'm teaching law students basically how to become public defenders. I've learned about the Elijah McClain case maybe much the same as you all in reading about it in the media. And I've personally been involved in some protests and acts of, speaking out against that type of police violence. It's something that I see a lot of my clients as public defenders, and then a lot of our students' clients in the clinic, right, are subject to that same type of police violence. In a lot of cases, I might venture to say in most cases, for no real good reason, right? There's media portrayals of folks of color as being, dangerous, and there are these narratives in public spaces about incorrect narratives, right, about folks of color being particularly dangerous or violent, and it's just not true, right? I mean, people of color commit crimes at the same rates as white people, and so these narratives have developed as a way to sort of maintain white supremacy, and that's really problematic. So I think what I have been, I guess, maybe poorly trying to explain is that I think the roots of this defund the police movement are a response to that, right? That policing and just policing has become and always has been a really racist and violent institution. And so we look to the police to protect our communities and to serve us and to keep us safe. And unfortunately, the police just don't serve that role for most communities of color, and that's really problematic, right? Because I'm sure all of us are advocates for racial justice and racial equality, and so and I'm not saying this across the board. I'm sure there are situations where police aren't racist and aren't violent, but as institutions, I think that's really they are those things. They are racist and violent institutions, and so that's why people are advocating to really take a look at them and rethink whether they serve the role we want them to serve in our communities. That was kind of a long answer to your question, Jasmine, but is that, do you have any follow-up questions? Or does anyone else have any questions?
No, but thank you so much.
Sure, of course. Thank you for the question. It was a good question.
I just wanted to comment that I think that's a really important distinction between talking about the institution of policing being racist versus individual police officers being racist. Not to say that there aren't individual police officers that are racist, but I think when we're having these conversations in the debate round, sometimes the choices we make in terms of how we talk about things is really important. And I think that that's just an important distinction to think about, and I appreciated hearing that. I also really, could you maybe talk a little bit about, so you are using the term over policing. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Sure. So social science research and, statistics show that police resources are allocated disproportionately to communities of color, right? So the police presence in poor communities and communities of color is greater than the police presence in affluent communities and white communities, right? So what that means and what that leads to is, I talked about how white people and people of color, rich people and poor people tend to, people commit crimes at the same rates across our society, but because the police are disproportionately present in poor communities and communities of color, the people who live in those communities are more often subject to police enforcement, right? So so they're disproportionately implicated in the criminal punishment system, and then you all have likely heard the phrase mass incarceration, right? And that's a large part of what contributes to people of color being disproportionately represented in the folks who are in prison, right? So this over policing in poor communities and communities of color has a direct link to mass incarceration, which disproportionately affects people of color. Another piece to answer Jessica's question is, many of you have probably heard of school resource officers, police officers in schools. And, those officers tend to disproportionately write tickets and enforce laws against students of color. And that likewise contributes to what some in the work I do, refer to the school to prison pipeline, right? And so it kind of, when school resource officers are more often enforcing laws and rules against students of color, then they get implicated in the juvenile justice system, which means they're more likely to be implicated later in the adult criminal system. And it kind of starts a negative domino effect, if you will, for those folks, or can, right? It doesn't have to, but it can. And like Jessica was saying, I think it's important to distinguish. I'm talking largely along systemic lines here, right? Like that's not the case for every single student of color is not given a ticket in school or subject to police enforcement in school, but disproportionately students of color are subject to those types of police enforcement. So does that answer your question, Jessica? I may have gotten off topic there a bit, but.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, of course. Yeah, so, and I think over time, like I was saying, a lot of police cars, for example, have the motto "Protect and Serve" painted on their doors, right? And that's like what we think of police as being dispatched to do, is to protect us and serve our communities. And I don't think that as institutions, they're really well known these days for doing either of those things. And I think that's because law enforcement has been prioritized over community safety, right? So if you think about, for example, like the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, if any of you saw those on TV, you know, you see police wearing like riot gear and driving tanks that look like they maybe belong more in a theater of war than on the streets of downtown Denver. But when I at least see that police and riot gear and tanks rolling down the street of the city in which I live, that sort of imparts fear in me and doesn't necessarily give me a sense of security and safety. And I come from a lot of privilege, right? I identify as a white person, and that's sort of the chord it strikes in me. So I can't imagine how that must feel to the communities of color that are over policed and against whom violence is used by police, right? So it's that type of, it's kind of come to a head, I think, and people are really, you know, and that's because Black people have been murdered by police over and over and over and over, and it's, you know, I mean, become I think more highly publicized. For example, in George Floyd's case, in Breonna Taylor's case, and Elijah McClain's case, and I could go on and on, right? But that's been happening for time immemorial, right? For as long as police have existed, there have been these kind of extrajudicial killings by police, and certainly no one thinks that police killing anyone is protecting and serving people, right? So we have the court systems because they're designed to afford people process and to be sure that people are treated fairly and that they're given an opportunity to be adjudged by a jury of their peers and punished by a judge if they're convicted. And when the police take matters into their own hands, like they have in those cases, it just skirts all of those rules that are designed to, and I'm not saying they always do mean that proceedings are fair, but at least that's what they're designed to do. And so when police take matters into their own hands, it sort of throws all of that intent of fairness out the window. So the other piece, I think, that is problematic in terms of the way police function right now, this was also mentioned in your materials, is that police are asked to respond and address situations that they're just not trained to respond to or address, right? Specifically, the incidence of police being dispatched to mental health crises is increased exponentially over time. And police, you know, I mean, there are folks who go to school for years and years to learn how to effectively de-escalate and be kind in response to people who are experiencing mental health crises. And police often, you know, I think they probably have some training in relation to how to respond to that type of thing, but it's certainly not their area of expertise or their wheelhouse. So I think a lot of what people are talking about when they're talking about defunding police is really reallocating resources from police to people who are trained specifically to respond to those experiencing mental health crises, right? Whether it's, you know, I think our community here in Denver has some like mobile mental health crisis response teams, and those are folks who are trained to de-escalate situations and help people get to maybe an inpatient facility where they can get training by other people who are trained to address people with mental health challenges. And so you might imagine when the police don't, you know, I mean, they're empowered to protect themselves. And so when a person is having a mental health crisis, sometimes, not always, the police perceive that they are in danger, and so they use violent force against those folks, and it's unnecessarily escalates the situation and puts people in harm's way, I suppose both police and private citizens. And so I think that's one thing, at least this defund the police movement is aimed at doing, is really reallocating resources to people who are trained to do the things that police are being asked to do. Another I saw as a public defender quite a bit that people are implicated in the criminal system because they use drugs that are prescribed under the law or illegal to use or possess, right? And drug use and drug dependence issues I see as more of a public health issue than a criminal issue, right? Just because a person possesses or uses drugs doesn't necessarily mean that they're, you know, they may not be doing right by their body, right? Or they may not be, you know, contributing positively to themselves or other people, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're harming the community, right? And so I think another thing this defund the police movement is designed to do is to really think about the root causes of some criminal behavior, right? And drug use and dependence issues may be at the root of some of those issues. And so people want to see financial resources that are currently allocated to police reallocated to drug use prevention, drug treatment, mental health treatment, and things like that, right? So, so that our communities can be healthier and so that people can be more actively contributory to their communities. So, does that make sense to folks? Do people have questions about that?
No.
Okay. Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really important to me about this discussion and why I'm so excited this is one of the affirmatives is because I think it's one of I think it's something that's very, very misunderstood by the general public, and especially what you were just talking about the difference between, you know, that really we're talking about reallocating as opposed to defunding and just kind of changing the way we're responding to these issues. I just think that's a really important part. Are there other ways that you think people misunderstand? Because I think a lot of people have very emotional reactions to the phrase defund the police, or when we start talking about that. So are there other misconceptions that you've encountered, Sarah?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead, Jessica, I'm sorry.
No, that's my question.
Okay, yeah. That's a great question. I think you're right that the public perception, I mean, because when people hear the phrase defund the police, there's sort of this visceral emotional reaction, like, right? Because what we were talking about is the police, I think, are supposed to protect our communities. And when people hear defund the police, it's like, well, what are we going to be left with? Anarchy, right? Are we going to be asked to protect ourselves? What are we going to do if we're in an emergency situation and there are no police to call? And I don't think anyone who advocates for defunding the police is advocating for anarchy, or maybe some are, but I don't think that's the largely people's intent, but rather to kind of rethink the way we organize our communities and how we approach public safety, right? Because ultimately, I think that's what people want, is for their communities to be safe and have the resources needed to give people chances to live healthy and fulfilling lives, right? And that's not the case currently. So people want to see resources reallocated. And I was talking about mental health treatment, drug treatment, counseling, and but also I think people want to see resources reallocated to like job training and education and getting people accessible and affordable health care and housing, right? Like these are things that are very, very fundamental to be before you can think about really being engaged in education or being engaged in a drug treatment program or mental health treatment or job training or whatever it may be. Like you need to have a stable roof over your head, and you need to have healthy food to eat. And so to address like social problems like that at their root, I think is what these people who are advocating to defund the police are really getting at. And maybe their messaging needs to change, to Jessica's point, so that people in the general public understand that really we're not advocating for anarchy, but rather to address the root causes of these social issues that lead to what some perceive as the need for more police, right? And more resources for police. Like, just, it's the movement to defund the police, I think, is more a movement to kind of just take a step back and rethink how we approach community safety. So I saw in your resources that a statistic I thought was interesting, that out of 10.3 million arrests each year, only 5% are for the most serious offenses like murder, rape, and aggravated assault. I thought that was a really fascinating statistic. So think about that, like 5%, right? And so of course, like, we want the police to make sure people aren't continuing to murder people or rape people or assault people with weapons or whatever it may be, right? Like, we don't want anyone to be in a situation where they're harmed. And if police can prevent that, of course, we all want that, right? But the other 95% of the arrests that police make maybe aren't violent or aren't those most serious offenses. So how can we rethink how we respond to those things, right? Like, why are people stealing, for example? Well, maybe in part it's because they don't have the resources they need to, you know, do the things they want to do in life. And so, you know, and I'm not saying it's okay to steal by any means, but it's just like, let's rethink the why people are doing the things they're doing that aren't violent. And is there something we could do to support our communities in ways that could prevent that, right? I think that's what the defund the police movement is about, more so than like taking people who protect other people off the streets or leaving us to our own devices to protect ourselves, right? I don't think that's what the defund the police movement is about. I also think it's interesting to think that there's no social science or other evidence to suggest that more police or more surveillance by the government leads to fewer crimes or greater community safety. So increasing the police presence doesn't help us, doesn't help our communities in terms of being more safe. And so, you know, here's what the research shows. So I think also the defund the folks who advocate for the defund the police movement or for reallocation of resources away from police are saying, like, look, social science shows that more police don't help us achieve our goal of public safety. So let's rethink this and go a different route. You may have heard that, you know, the definition of insanity is to continue doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I think that's kind of along the lines of what these folks are saying, is like, we've been doing this policing thing since the beginning of the 19th century, in the North at least, and it's not making us any safer. So let's try something different. So does that make sense to folks? Do people have questions about that?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right. Yeah, the other thing I think that people, I talked a little bit about the history of policing in the South, but the history of policing in the North, I think, was similarly, it actually, like, police haven't existed forever. In the North, police have really only existed since the beginning of the 19th century. But they were designed mostly to kind of, there was like a racist narrative underlying the policing in the North from the beginning as well. Like, immigrants and poor folks, African Americans and other people of color were over policed. And I think that there have been kind of few standards for hiring and training officers until very recently. So ultimately what policing as an institution has done is kind of further oppressed, marginalized communities and maintain a socioeconomic and racial status quo, right? And so that's problematic for obvious reasons for those who, you know, see racial justice and racial equity as a goal of our society, which I certainly do. So yeah, I'm happy to take questions. Those were the notes I had in relation to defunding the police, but I'm happy to ask questions. And as Jessica said, you can ask questions in the chat or speak up, please, if you have any questions, or Jessica or Jillian have questions, happy to answer them as well.
So as they plan their affirmative arguments, an important thing to do in preparation for debate is to anticipate what some of their opponents' arguments might be. Are there arguments that you're aware of or that you've encountered? I think we just kind of briefly talked a little bit, but negative arguments against advocating for defunding the police, and maybe some strategies for how to answer those arguments?
Sure. Well, I mean, the feeling in community of safety, and that you know, like kind of having peace of mind to know that if you're in a situation, an emergency situation, or a situation where you need help, that some community resource exists to come to your aid, right? And quickly, whether it's a health emergency or you're in trouble, you know, like whatever that looks like. And I think people, folks who argue against defunding the police are concerned that those resources won't be present if resources are allocated away from police, right? Like, what if all the police are out helping other people, and when we're in trouble, there's no one left to come to our aid, right? Like, I think that's probably a concern about reallocating resources away from police, but I just don't know that there is social science research to show that concern comes to fruition, right? Like, I don't think, I think communities can understand historical patterns of when police resources have been needed and allocate resources accordingly, right? I think another thing is, well, I'll leave it there. I guess you may be able to glean that I personally come down on one side of this, right? Just because I see clients who come from kind of less privileged background socioeconomically, and like could really use the support of the community for very basic needs like stable housing and healthy food and opportunities, you know, educational opportunities to support them around maybe learning disabilities or whatever it is, right? And I think that I've just seen in individual clients' cases over and over and over, if they had those resources, they do have the potential to do great things and contribute in really wonderful ways to their communities. But when people don't have those opportunities and that foundation, they just kind of keep getting caught up in these systems that bring them down, right? And so I think it would be really, really helpful to a lot of folks, at least, to have the community's help, right? And so people see that the police is not providing that, but yeah.
Could you speak a little bit to what role the federal government has in this issue as opposed to state and local governments?
Yeah, that's a really complicated, I think, it's a great question, Jessica, but it's a complicated issue. I think I read in your materials that about 20% of the funding for state and local police authority comes from the federal government, which I actually didn't know before I read those materials. And I think that may, to the extent those monies and those financial resources are allocated or contingent upon police enforcement in certain ways, or like, for example, like if the federal government will say, we won't give you these resources if they're not used to enforce the war on drugs or whatever that is. Like, that could be problematic because, like I was saying, where poor communities and communities of color are over policed, the war on drugs tends to be the war on communities of color and war on poor people, and that's unfair, right? I don't think anyone argues anything different. So, you know, to the extent federal dollars are conditioned on enforcing laws in certain ways, I think it's problematic because every community knows what their own issues are and is in a better position than the federal government to know what their needs are, right? And how they should allocate their resources. So it seems to me that where federal resources may be needed, but if they could be allocated in ways, like I was saying, to actually kind of address the root issues that eventually kind of lead to crime in communities, that would be really great. And I don't know enough about, honestly, Jessica, how that works, except for having read in your materials that a lot of those funds are conditioned on, you know, policing in a certain way, which is problematic because I think communities really know what's best for themselves.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an interesting question too. So yeah.
Well, we have about 15 more minutes if folks have other questions, and they don't have to be limited to the defund the police argument. We can, you know, ask Professor Hidebrand anything topic related, or if you have questions about what it's like to be a public defender, or questions about law school, or any interest you might have in the legal profession. I'm sure she's a wonderful resource for those questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what did inspire you to become a public defender?
Yeah, it's a great question. I knew that I wanted to do something public interest oriented, and I actually wasn't sure what that looked like when I first went to law school. I actually started law school at the University of Oregon in Eugene because I thought at first I was interested in environmental law, and wanting to kind of advocate for preservation of our environment, right? And our advocating for creatures who can't advocate for themselves in courts of law and things like that. And then I really did some soul searching and realized that connecting with people is kind of what makes me tick, and that I was learning more at that time about systemic injustice and systemic racism and mass incarceration, and so I kind of found my community and my people in law school that way, and enrolled in the criminal defense clinic myself, the clinic in which I now teach, and I just really found I feel like I found my place in the law and found my place in kind of my life's work, right? Not to be cliche, but that I really feel like I found something that called out to me, and that I think is really important way to use my education and my privilege to help my community, hopefully, right? And yeah, I mean, sometimes it's like people are in situations, like I said, where what they really need is like help getting their feet under them, and if so, as a public defender, you of course advocate for people in court in criminal cases and defend them, but a lot of what being a public defender is about also is like social work in some ways, and I really enjoy that because it's our systems aren't designed to facilitate people availing themselves of the resources they need very easily, right? Sometimes it's tricky to navigate those systems, and so to the extent I can help them do that, I feel really privileged and lucky to be able to do that. So that was kind of a long and roundabout answer to your question, but that's how I landed where I landed. And then I was lucky enough to be invited by my former professors to come back and teach law students how to be public defenders. And so things kind of came full circle for me. And I'm really enjoying the opportunity to engage with students and to see the fire they have for the work that I also have is a really, really neat way to connect with folks as well. So.
That's awesome. And that's amazing that everything has come full circle for you. That must feel really great and be really affirming that you are where you need to be. That's very
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Ashley. Hi, Ashley.
Okay.
Welcome. She asked, what do most of your cases revolve around?
Yeah, so it's a good question, Ashley. The answers to the question is different when I was a public defender, and currently the cases our students' clients have. So I'll answer in both contexts. So, well, when I started as a public defender, and when most people start as public defenders, you start in county court, where people are charged with misdemeanor offenses, which are kind of less serious offenses, still serious and still very much affect people's lives in important ways. But that's kind of where you learn the ropes as a public defender, so to speak. And the cases charged most in county court, I would say, that's where like driving under the influence and their theft cases, drug possession cases, misdemeanor assault cases, like domestic violence kind of things. So that's kind of I would say, the majority of cases there. And those are the types of cases our students' clients handle too. So our students' clients are charged in county court, which is what I was just talking about, as well as in municipal court, where people are charged with violations of municipal ordinances. So kind of similar to misdemeanors, where the potential penalties are still meaningful and still impactful in people's lives, but not as severe as in district court. So then kind of shifting gears back to when I was a public defender, after you're in county court, you then go to district court, where people are charged with felony offenses. And in district court, I represented people charged with all kinds of crimes, including but not limited to sex assaults and murders, burglaries, aggravated assault, all kinds of things. So.
awesome. So do we have any more questions? Great. Well, then thank you so much, Sarah, for being here this morning. We really appreciate it. Personally, I learned a lot in the last hour, so that's always good. It's always good to learn something new every day. We are going to take a short break before our next presentation. If you could go ahead and type your name and what pizza you would like. So we're going to send everybody 2 pizzas with 2 toppings each. So if you can put those orders in the chat window, we'll make sure that those pizzas are delivered to you at lunchtime. But we don't need your addresses. Jillian already has your addresses, so that's all good. So thanks again, Sarah.
Really my pleasure. Thanks everyone for attending and being so engaged, and good luck to you all in your tournaments.
Okay.
And Jessica and Jillian, let me know if I can help moving forward, okay?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.